So I just want to say what an honor it is to be joined by the General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board, Jennifer Abruzzo. All the administration and your office has done for working people has not gone unnoticed by the Oregon labor movement, and we're honored to have you join us for this important conversation that will be aired at our convention coming up. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but I'm glad I can participate virtually.
Absolutely. Well, we're just going to go through a few questions that I think folks would be really interested in the room. And the first question I've got for you is that, everybody in this room likely spends a fair amount of time and resources interacting with the NLRB. So the question to you is, what can union staff do when interacting with the board to help the board do its job as quickly and efficiently as possible?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So the agency, and particularly for those in the field, we're doing the best we can with the funding and the resources that we have. So what I would say is that union staff should make sure that at the time that they're filing an unfair labor practice charge, that all witnesses are available to provide affidavits and to provide relevant information, documentation. And union staff should help coordinate that if possible, getting the contact info and the like. And the same applies if we go to trial, just helping with the coordination of the witnesses. Similarly, with regard to representation cases, workers and other witnesses need to be available for both our pre and post-election hearings. And the final thing I'll say is that I know that union staff may be frustrated with delays in case processing, which is understandable because we are not fully staffed up because of our lack of adequate appropriations. But please don't take out your frustrations on the field agents. Don't be disrespectful to them, please. But certainly if you haven't heard from a board agent in a while, there's nothing wrong with reaching out to learn what's happening in the case.
Great, thank you. Another question I've got for you, and I'm curious about, how did you get involved in labor law, and what has made you stick with the career that you've spent inside the NLRB? And kind of a follow-up to that is just what drew you to being such a passionate advocate for working people?
So what I'll say about getting involved in labor law, when I was in law school, this will be real quick. I was a single mom. I worked during the day and went to law school at night. And labor law was not offered at night. So I actually asked my evidence professor, who was the only professor at our school that taught labor law during the day, if I could clerk for him. So I did. And then about a year after I graduated, he contacted me and recommended me for a position at the NLRB, told me I had to take it if it was offered. And I did. And it's just an awesome agency with an awesome responsibility, because we are the only federal agency that enforces this pro-worker statute. And since there's no private right of action, meaning workers can't go into court, we need to get it right each and every time. And all board agents know this, and they are talented and committed, and I'm so proud of the work that they're doing. Just to say, as to my passion, I was raised in a blue-collar neighborhood in Queens, New York. Both of my parents were union members. I saw how their negotiated wages and benefits really helped improve our lives, but many others in my neighborhood were not as fortunate. So it was really important to me to do all I could to advance equity for others in my community. And frankly, if not now, then when, right?
Thank you. Love it. So what do you consider to be the most important initiatives that your office is currently undertaking? And kind of a follow-up is just curious about the achievements that you're most proud of during your first few years as general counsel.
So I would say all of my initiatives are important. But I think one of the things that I've really tried to do during the course of my 2 years is to ask the board to reconsider precedent that went well beyond the Trump years, right? Such as that related to voluntary recognition of unions that enjoy majority support, where the employer has no good faith doubt that they don't. compensating workers for the lost opportunity to make gains in bargaining when an employer unlawfully fails to bargain with a certified rep, looking at economic realities that detrimentally affect workers, whether it be non-compete agreements, whether it be mandatory captive audience meetings that I think unlawfully interfere with workers' Section 7 rights. I think all of, just looking at and broadly construing the statute and our role and our congressional mandate. I will also say I'm really, really proud of our board agents, especially when it comes to remedying violations in the settlement realm. We are requiring not only 100% back pay, we're certainly not nickel and diming workers, but we're also asking for any direct or foreseeable consequential harms that workers might have experienced if they were discharged, for example, like medical bills because they lost their insurance, or late credit card fees because they could not, they had no income and they had to pay for their food or their rent on their credit card and then couldn't pay the late fees that may be associated with that. So our settlement program is working, I would say, extremely well. We settle over 95% of cases that we find merit to, and also, you're also settling the chilling effect on the entire workplace where there's been violations, right? So we're getting employers to change their handbooks, to put them in plain language, to make sure that employees have a notice of their rights under the NLRA. They go on job announcements, they go on job applications, anything where we can really educate workers about their rights and about that there's an agency out there to make sure that those rights are protected and to remedy violations. The other thing I would say is, our partnerships with other worker protection agencies like the EEOC and DOL are really, they've become even more robust. We are, cutting out all the silos and really engaging with one another and sharing information with one another. But we're also engaged with other agencies that you wouldn't think necessarily would be considered worker protection, but they are in a sense, right? So the FTC and DOJ antitrust and CFPB, because workers are consumers, and certainly like non-competes affect worker mobility, and that's something that the FTC is looking at. So we all have to, I think this administration has done a really nice job of making sure that this government is taking a holistic approach. The greatest achievement, though, at the end of the day, is the work that is performed each and every day by the board agents, particularly those in the field, and during very challenging times.
Love that you mentioned a couple things. I mean, I'm proud of all of those things as well, those accomplishments, but a few of the items I know we've taken up in state advocacy as well. And I know the labor movement in Oregon is really proud of that, from being the first state to ban captive audience meetings, knowing the challenges of federal labor law and non-compete reform as well. So really heartened to hear that focus of your administration as well. Another question I've got is, you mentioned funding earlier. We're all aware of the intentional strategy by corporate America to undermine and underfund your agency. So, even though there was a slight improvement in the last congressional budget, could you share more about the dire need for additional and robust funding and what the underfunding of such a critical agency means for working people in the labor movement in a state like Oregon?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we were grateful for the little bump up in our budget. And now, the budget is at $299 million after being flat funded for 9 years at $274 million. But, really after inflationary costs, that $299 million just allows us to keep our lights on, and, very little increase in staffing, unfortunately, not anything close to the much needed investments in our failing IT infrastructure that we need, because we just don't have the funds to do it. So I have filled all of our vacant regional director positions, which are the top senior leaders of our agency in various geographic areas around the country. There were 8 or so that were vacant when I arrived 2 years ago. There was really not a lot of backfilling, if any, while I was gone. Because I was gone for a 3+ year period during the Trump years, after spending 23 years at the NLRB at that time. But so as I said earlier, I mean, the staffing situation is still very dire, particularly when you consider the case intake, the increase in cases, both the ULP cases and our cases, which is great. I think it's great that workers, are finally like elevating their voices, wanting to be heard, wanting a seat at the bargaining table, and filing charges or petitions or both. But the problem is, because of the resource issue, there are real delays in case processing, and we do not want to be an obstacle when it comes to worker empowerment and worker voice. I mean, I personally think we need at least 100 million more in order to hire up sufficiently and to enhance our infrastructure and really operate as we're mandated to.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So in your experience, what NLRA rights or board procedures do you think unions most need to educate their members and staff about?
Yeah, so I mean, workers, as I just said, they need to know they have the right to engage in union activity and protected concerted activity, like improving health and safety issues without being subject to retaliation. And I will just say, oftentimes it's forgotten, and I know what you all do for a living, but oftentimes it's forgotten that we protect workers' rights even in non-represented facilities. And we're trying cases now involving Black Lives Matter protests, where people are engaged in racial, economic, and social justice advocacy that obviously affect a broader societal interest, but also are connected to improving workplaces in general. So and we actually just were successful in winning a Black Lives Matter protest case. But I think what workers need to know, there's an agency out there that's going to protect their rights when they're violated. I will tell you one thing, just anecdotally, really quickly. I was watching Trevor Noah. He was interviewing Chris Smalls, who's the now president of the Amazon Labor, right? And, it was this whole David and Goliath story of like, how are you able to be successful at the JFK Amazon warehouse facility in Staten Island? And I was expecting, and Trevor Noah said, what was the biggest challenge you faced in beating this Goliath? I was expecting that he would say something along the lines, some egregious behavior, like there were mandatory captive audience meetings every hour on the hour, and we were all subject to a million of them. And but instead he said the hardest thing was for him to convince his coworkers that they had a right to organize, and that there was an agency out there that would protect their right to organize and protect them from being retaliated against. So, I mean, the key for me is like, I think we all, like, with knowledge comes power, right? So education is key, because, frankly, employers bank on the lack of knowledge that workers have, and then they engage in, unfair labor practices, nipping in the bud organizing drives. So I think we just really, all of us need to do a better job of educating workers about all of the rights that they have. And in terms of board procedure, I would say just manage expectations. Unfortunately, our process could take a long time, from investigation to litigation to enforcement of a board order. And that's why we try to settle cases and have been very successful. Obviously, justice delayed is justice denied. So I think those two, educating about rights and that there's an agency out there, and then just managing those expectations once charges or petitions are filed.
Great, thank you. So as the labor movement continues to advocate for comprehensive labor law reforms like bills, or with bills like the PRO Act, what room does the NLRB have under the current law to reform labor law in a positive direction? And if you could choose one thing in the NLRA for Congress to change, what would it be?
Okay, well, this is so I think I answered some of this question earlier when I was talking about initiatives and achievements, but I mean, look, the statute has very broad language, our current statute, and it should be construed broadly, right? As I said earlier, there is no private right of action for workers to go into court. So we should be covering as many workers as possible. We should be covering as many employing entities as possible, single employers, joint employers, and the like. We need to make sure we're considering rules and policies and actions from the perspective of an economically dependent employee, and that we're taking into account actual industrial and workplace realities, and that we're using our expansive remedial authority under Section 10. So we can do all that right now, and I'm trying to do as much of that as I can and getting a lot of things to the board so that they can hopefully agree with me, and my positions are very reasonable, so I would expect they'll agree with me, and then we can actually get the precedent out there and make sure that we really are robustly effectuating our mission based upon the statutory language that we currently have, the broad statutory language. In terms of like one thing, I mean, there's so many things in the PRO Act and other legislation out there that I think I would like Congress to change. But I think one of the things, when it comes to labor law, I think one of the things that other worker protection statutes have that we don't have, that I think would really go a long way to deter violations, because that's what we want. We don't want to see violations. We don't want workers' rights to be violated, right? Is if there was a penalty, like where we could assess penalties for violations of workers' rights. I think that that would go a long way to deterring violations and making bad employer or employees subject to bad conduct truly whole.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing that. So what would you say, as a final question, what would you say to the members and leaders of the Oregon labor movement who are here about the future of workers' rights and labor law? And what is most inspiring to you about this moment, that we are in with incredible labor activism?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, like, right now we're seeing more and more workers around this country learning about and exercising their rights to organize and to be heard. At our agency, and I'm sure you're seeing it also, we've seen a surge of underserved, underrepresented, vulnerable populations, oftentimes communities of workers of color, really trying to get a voice and or elevate their voice and get a seat at the table. And that's whether through traditional labor organizations or through homegrown ones. I don't think it matters. What matters is that workers at McDonald's and Amazon and Starbucks and Home Depot and everything else in between, that they're feel empowered to engage with their employers about substandard wages and benefits, health and safety, inequitable treatment, lack of opportunities. And so I think that it's a moment for unions to be nimble in how they deal with workers, because I think that the traditional model that we all have known for decades has to make room for other models, so that the current workforce feels that they're being heard by advocates, and there can't be any one size fits all, right? So when it comes to organizing, communicating by text or other platforms as opposed to knocking on doors or meetings may be the way to go in many situations. Same thing with the bargaining table. We're seeing it now, how bargaining is conducted, whether it's in person, whether it's virtual, whether it's a hybrid, everything in between. So I just think we all just need to, make sure that we're not trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. And at the end of the day, what I'll say is, and you all know this, there is strength in numbers. Workers aren't alone. I think that we, as a community facing the challenges that we have with the pandemic and still face, that we really need to help encourage and promote productive labor management relations, because that's going to get us to a place where there's stability in the workplace. And I think if we can all help make sure that in our own ways, help make sure that workers' voices are heard and issues are addressed in a very positive way. There'll be good outcomes, there'll be less conflict, and then workers and their families and our communities and, you know, the economy and our country will have the opportunity to flourish. So I thank you all for all you're doing for workers in this country. I really appreciate you allowing me to be here and enjoy your conference.
Well, thanks again to you, your team, and for everything that the Biden-Harris administration has done and is doing for workers and to strengthen the labor movement. Thanks again.
Take care. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.